Russia celebrates as Donald Trump berates the Ukrainian president. Meanwhile, Chinese warships lap the Australian continent in a show of force. Australia's deteriorating security outlook comes into sharp focus on the eve of an election campaign. I'm David Speers. Welcome to Insiders. They were extraordinary scenes after a heated argument with Donald Trump in the Oval Office, carried live like a reality TV show. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy was ordered out of the White House. No deal was signed over critical minerals. No assurances were given over ongoing US support. European leaders fear the US is walking away from Ukraine, giving Vladimir Putin an enormous victory 3 years on from Russia's invasion. As allies question the reliability of Trump's America, China is showing off its military might. 3 warships have been circumnavigating Australia, causing anxiety, exposing vulnerabilities and creating political headaches for the Albanese government. Peter Dutton, meanwhile, had headaches of his own, forced to deny any insider trading when he made a timely purchase of bank shares during the global financial crisis.
Opposition leader Peter Dutton's share portfolio under scrutiny.
Labor is questioning whether the opposition leader had inside information when he traded bank shares during the global financial crisis.
Was he aware that the government was about to bail out the banks when he made these share trades?
That's all Labor know how to do. They are the grubbiest people you will ever come across. At Murray, you are the king grub.
So you deny acting with inside information?
Of course.
We are perhaps 5 days from a federal election being called. The Labor Party dirt unit is powering up.
Opposition leader Peter Dutton has fired back over questions about his family's property and share dealings.
I've been proud of what my family and I have been able to achieve.
It's a matter for Peter Dutton.
All at sea, the PM in the crosshairs over Chinese warships.
The Prime Minister is being accused of misleading the Australian public over what he knew and when.
Revelations: the Australian government found out China was conducting live-fire military drills
Through aviation authorities, half an hour after it began.
Is it the case that Defence was only notified via Virgin and Air Services Australia 28 minutes after the firing window commenced?
Yes.
We have protested and made our position clear that more notice should have been given.
It just doesn't add up.
At it again, trying to turn China into an election issue.
It's really important that we take a deep breath here.
In unprecedented scenes in the Oval Office.
You're playing cards. You're gambling with the lives of millions of people. You're gambling with World War III.
A public dressing down. It devolved into a shouting match.
Please, you think that if you will speak very loudly about the war, you can...
He's not speaking loudly. He's not speaking loudly. Your country's in big trouble.
Can I
Wait a minute. No. You've done a lot of talking.
Essentially kicked his guest out of the building, saying he can, quote, come back when he is ready for peace.
Driving away, he may have blown his one big chance to get Donald Trump on his side.
But you're either going to make a deal or we're out.
We will continue to stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes, because this is the struggle of a democratic nation versus an authoritarian regime led by Vladimir Putin, who clearly has imperialistic designs not just on Ukraine, but throughout that region.
It doesn't matter what I'm considering. I'm just telling you, you saw what I saw today. That was not a man that wanted to make peace. And I'm only interested if he wants to end the bloodshed. Thank you very much, everybody.
My guest this morning is Shadow Home Affairs Minister James Paterson. First, let's check what's making news. And here are some of the front pages around the world. Trump humiliates Zelenskyy, Oval Office shouting match, a spectacle to horrify the world. This moment has caused shock. And take a look at this. President Zelenskyy flew straight from Washington to London, where British Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer gave him a big hug outside number 10 Downing Street and then gave this commitment.
You have full backing across the United Kingdom. And we stand with you, with Ukraine, for as long as it may take. And I hope you heard some of that cherry in the street.
As long as it may take. Well, back here, the Prime Minister won't be calling the election today, but both sides are making more pre-campaign pledges. Labor is sticking with a health theme, promising another 50 urgent care clinics on top of 87 opened this term. Peter Dutton is sticking with national security, telling News Corp papers he would spend $3 billion buying another 28 F-35 Joint Strike Fighters. The latest poll shows Labor clawing back some support. A Redbridge tracking poll in marginal seats shows the coalition's lead has fallen from a 4-point lead to a 1-point lead over the past fortnight. In Victoria, however, the numbers remain grim for Labor, with 8 seats at risk of being lost. And finally, News Corp reports China gave Papua New Guinea at least 2 weeks' notice of its warship exercises, despite leaving Australia in the dark about the task group that's been tracking around the coastline. Well, this week was a week that crystallised the deteriorating security outlook for Australia. China now has the world's biggest navy in ship numbers, and it's letting Australia know the live firing, exercises, the other things it's been doing around the coastline should be considered now the new normal. Australia's capacity to even monitor the warships has looked questionable. And at the same time, Donald Trump's treatment of Ukraine's president is causing alarm amongst US allies, worried that he's abandoning Europe and playing right into Putin's hands. The global order is shifting rapidly, and this can't be brushed aside in the coming election campaign. Let's see what the panel makes of it. We're joined this week by Clare Armstrong, Michael Stutchbury, welcome back to the couch, and Shalailah Medhora. Good to have you all here. Look, Clare, these really were extraordinary scenes in the Oval Office. I want to start there because everybody's talking about it right around the world. I don't think we've witnessed anything quite like it, certainly on live TV. What was going on there?
Well, it was shocking to watch what had been a tense, you might say, conversation for the first 40 or so minutes of that open sort of huddle in the Oval Office to what descended into, I mean, a mudslinging match doesn't even cover it. It was out and out bullying, the ambush of having Vice President JD Vance attend that meeting. And I think it really exposed the thinking in the Trump administration around Ukraine, the fact that they were obsessing over things like whether Zelenskyy had expressed enough thanks in front of the cameras. The fact he wasn't wearing...
Which he did, by the way.
Which he did.
He started with a thank you.
The fact he wasn't wearing a suit, to which he said, happy to put on a costume when my country is not at war. I think it was really theatre, and the most telling remark of all was toward the end when President Trump said, this will make great television. Yeah. It's grandstanding at its finest, and this is what we know, this is what he does. He likes to destabilise, to get the upper hand so that you can't predict what he may or may not do. He's secured, even in the last week, for example, Keir Starmer was one of the people that met with Trump, and he's agreed to lift UK defence spending to 3%. That's the kind of result that Donald Trump feels he gets from behaving in the way that we saw him.
Sure, but if this was a deliberate bit of theatre, as Clare puts, but a deliberate attempt to humiliate Zelenskyy, why, Stutch? Why is Donald Trump wanting to do that in front of the world's media?
Yeah, why does he want to give a win to Vladimir Putin is the big geostrategic thing. There's so much history between Trump and even now Vance and Zelenskyy, where there was a mini version of the Oval Office thing with Scott Morrison back in 2020 when Morrison went for a pickfack with Trump in the Oval Office, and it descended into a 40-minute thing about the impeachment that was coming through of Trump, of which Zelenskyy had played a part to do with Biden's son and this whole thing. And when in the last election campaign, Vance, as he said, you campaigned for the Democrats in Pennsylvania. So there's this tension between...
What was he talking about there? Because I mean,
Zelenskyy appeared at an event which was seen to be a Democratic type event, and was seen to be from the Republican, the Trump camp, pro-Biden and the Democrats.
The leader, I mean, Scott Morrison appeared at a Trump event, that box factory in Ohio. But anyway,
in election campaign. So now you get to this situation, and it's going along, tense. They're there to sign this energy deal, the critical minerals deal, but really overshadowing it all is will Trump get his ceasefire, which he promised in 24 hours, but he won't give the security guarantee that Zelenskyy wants. Zelenskyy won't agree to a ceasefire because that will embolden the Russians. So you're at this stalemate and it's going along, and then Vance decides to ramp it up and Zelenskyy takes the bait, and they're off about, can you trust Vladimir Putin's word, which goes to Trump wants to make a deal with Vladimir Putin. So then it's all off, and now we go to Europe, and the key question is, can the Europeans in any way get their act get together to deliver what Trump really wants, as Claire says, is to get Europe to take more of the responsibility and the firepower for holding Vladimir Putin. And
I want to talk about that, but just to stick with what that moment, which, as you say, really played into Putin's hands. I mean, he was the big winner out of what we saw yesterday. I mean, theatre, reality TV show, he gets kicked out of the White House, all very dramatic. This appears to be a ruptured relationship now between these two leaders. Can they work together again? I did have a chat this morning before the show with Ukraine's ambassador to Australia, Vasyl Miroshnichenko. You'll be able to watch more of the interview on the news channel a bit later, but I just want to play you this little bit where he talks about how critical US support is. If they don't have US support, well, what's left for Ukraine?
We cannot survive without American commitment. We cannot survive without American support.
So that's interesting. So even if European leaders agree to step up their support, you're saying you cannot survive unless the US is part of this?
No, I mean, we will keep on fighting. We will not surrender. But to end this war, we need American involvement, and everybody needs American involvement.
And what happens if that's not there?
America, this is the world which we live in. Republic of Korea needs America. Japan needs America.
So if it's not there, what happens? What happens to Ukraine?
Well, it will. The war will last. We'll keep on fighting, but it will be more difficult, and we will be losing ground. But we'll keep on fighting.
They'll keep fighting. They'll lose ground. He's very worried about if Russia does take control ultimately of Ukraine, where they're left without a country. So even if Europe does step up, he's saying they still need that US support, that access to weapons systems and so on from the US. But, I mean, Stutch is right, Shalailah. It's now up to Europe to decide what to do. We saw Keir Starmer there with Zelenskyy giving him a big hug. We'll be with you, ongoing to the end. But will the rest of Europe be able to step up enough?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the question, right? I mean, after this exchange, we saw a barrage of tweets and of statements from all across Europe just saying, we stand with Ukraine. And really what that press conference, or that what was assuming a pick fact turned into a press conference nearly, showed was that the complete and utter isolation of the US's position now when compared to other comparable democracies. So we have a situation now where the US has isolated itself. Europe needs to step up. Countries like Germany have already started saying, can we really trust the US, even if they change their position in this instance? We really need to put more money towards this. But ultimately, Europe has only put forward a margin, a small margin more than the US has as one single country. So they're really going to have to step up in a big way, whether they have the capacity to do that.
And this is about more than Ukraine. It's about European security generally and how they manage without any sort of US assurance. For Australia, the Prime Minister we saw earlier reiterating Australia's ongoing support for Ukraine. But this is a really tricky political situation now, because I suspect a lot of Australian voters are saying, well, hang on, why can't you push back at Donald Trump, say what you really think about this extraordinary treatment of the leader of a democracy in Zelenskyy? But the Prime Minister, I mean, here he was yesterday, treading this careful line, making it clear that as far as he's concerned, Russia is the problem.
But I'll tell you how you get peace in Ukraine really quickly, which is to Russia stopping its illegal and immoral invasion, and Russia stopping the attacks on civilians, on civil infrastructure, engaging in this act of aggression that they have engaged in now for 3 years.
Look, it was pretty strong, Clare, in terms of, Russia's to blame. If Russia end this invasion, they'll have a quick peace. We're going to keep supporting Ukraine. Is he right, though, not to turn on Donald Trump here? Or is that a politically risky position for him?
A couple of things leading up to Zelenskyy's meeting with Trump. We had the French President Emmanuel Macron, as well as then Keir Starmer from the UK, softening the ground. Really, I mean, there were some amazing scenes. If Anthony Albanese is to go to the Oval Office in this next term, or Peter Dutton for that matter, recommend looking at how both those two leaders handled that situation, gently pushing back and fact-checking in real time the president.
But also flattering on other issues. And Keir Starmer had the letter from the King.
Even having laid that groundwork, I think what needs to be acknowledged here, and maybe what we haven't discussed yet, is Donald Trump is also spouting misinformation that is directly created and propagated by the Kremlin about who started the war, about whether it's undemocratic that because of martial law Zelenskyy hasn't had an election and his 5-year term ended a couple of months ago. So I think as much as I can totally understand public appetite from a personal point of view, I think we'd all love to see our world leaders really hold Trump's feet over the fire on the way that he's behaved around Ukraine. You're fighting a losing battle and potentially absenting yourself from the conversation if you do that.
And after the meeting, President Zelenskyy went on Fox News in the US and actually said, I asked him directly during our conversation if he was an agent of the Kremlin, basically. So those kind of conversations are not going past, you know, these sort of backroads or backroom conversations that we aren't seeing on camera. No. But it's a kind of weird position where the world is acting in a way that it has traditionally when it comes to diplomacy, and Trump is the only one who isn't. Yeah, the game has changed. Stutch, what do you think about the way Albanese is navigating this?
Well, I think we are seeing potentially the unravelling of the whole Western security alliance and the trade alliance of the rules-based order of the whole post-war system that has supported Australian prosperity. This may now be happening before our eyes. There's not much point in Albanese going out and having a go at Donald Trump. Justin Trudeau in Canada has gained a lot of political ground, actually, but he's been under direct assault from Trump over trade issues, and Trump says he wants to make Canada the 51st state. So he's got political ground gains from that, but there's no gains from Albanese in going out and having a go at Trump. We need to, I think the Western alliance needs to stand up for Ukraine totally and push back on the factual things, but we've got to there's no point in really poking the bear, but you've got the Western alliance and the Europe has to stand up together against this, but they don't want to, they want to bring US along with it. What is Trump's end game? It's hard to know. So, it could go actually not bad, or it could go terrible. So you want to just try and bring this thing along.
And what about Australia's support for Ukraine in all of this? I mean, the Prime Minister says it's ongoing. We know there are pressing security issues in our own region, and we're going to come to, what China's been up to and so on. But if the US is no longer supporting Ukraine, Europe finds a way to do it. Should Australia keep being a part of that?
At the moment, the government's position is that absolutely nothing is off the table. The requests that we've received from Ukraine to date for certain forms of support have been granted. But I think what's really interesting is very specifically the government has not ruled out, for example, even being part of a peacekeeping mission in Ukraine, which speaks to how committed the country actually is to supporting Europe and Ukraine in standing against Russia.
Yeah, interesting. All right, well, time to talk to the Shadow Home Affairs Minister, James Paterson, and to take us there, here was some more of those extraordinary scenes in the Oval Office yesterday.
You have to be thankful. You don't have the cards. You're buried there. Your people are dying. You're running low on soldiers. Listen, you're running low on soldiers. It would be a damn good thing. And then you tell us, I don't want a ceasefire. I don't want a ceasefire. I want to go and I want this. Look. If you could get a ceasefire right now, I tell you, you take it so the bullets stop flying and your men stop getting killed.
Of course, we want to stop the war.
But you're saying you don't want a ceasefire.
But I said to you,
I want a ceasefire.
With guarantees.
Because you'll get a ceasefire faster than an agreement.
Ask our people about ceasefire, what they think.
Senator James Paterson, welcome to the program.
Good morning, David.
So you're a strong and long-standing supporter of Ukraine. You've argued that it's unambiguously in our national interest to see Putin fail. Is Putin now about to get exactly what he wants?
You're right, David. We're very proud of our support for Ukraine, and I retain my view that we should strongly support President Zelenskyy and the people of Ukraine, regardless of anyone else's views on that matter, and we should continue to do so. I think we are being a bit premature here. Certainly the spectacular theatre in the White House, no one's going to gloss over that. But occasionally, even between allies, when there are issues of contention, diplomacy can be very robust. I think it is critical to have American leadership in the world. I think that's in the world's interest, and I think that's in America's interest. And I hope that we are able to achieve a ceasefire on acceptable terms to Ukraine.
But what does that mean if the ceasefire involves Russia keeping territory that's Ukraine's territory? Surely that doesn't stop there. I mean, Donald Trump clearly thinks, oh, that'll be fine then. Do you think so?
You might remember, David, when I was last on your program, we had a long discussion about ceasefires with Hamas and Hezbollah and Israel. And while everyone wanted to see a ceasefire and peace in those circumstances, the detail and the timing of the ceasefire was important. And that's also true for Ukraine. Because if there's a ceasefire that is forced on Ukraine, that is unacceptable to Ukraine, that is a significant win to Vladimir Putin that will not just embolden him, but it will embolden others around the world, including in our own region. And if there's a ceasefire without adequate security guarantees, particularly led by the United States, then there's nothing to stop Putin resuming his war at another stage when he's ready to do so, and that would be a disaster for everyone.
So you think that US security guarantee is a must?
Well, it's very hard to see how this peaceful peace can be durable if there isn't American leadership, if there isn't an American security guarantee. And that does seem to be something that is part of the negotiations between Zelenskyy and Trump, and we're all hopeful that that is able to be achieved.
And you touched on it a little earlier, but what message does this send to China?
There are two really important points to make here. We wouldn't want China to misinterpret what is happening in Europe in two respects. Firstly, we want the Americans to continue to support Ukraine because it is possible that China would take lessons out of that for our own region, including obviously in relation to Taiwan. That would be a disaster. But I think it's also would be a mistake for China to believe that the United States views the Indo-Pacific theatre in the same way that it views the European theatre. I travelled to the United States 3 times in the lead up to the last presidential election to meet with potential future appointees to a Trump or Harris administration. And even meeting with the most America-first people in the Republican foreign policy spectrum, they very clearly said to me that America is a resident power in the Pacific. There is no retreat for America from the Pacific, and we shouldn't expect to see that on this administration or any other.
What about Australia's ongoing support for Ukraine? The ABC launched Your Say during the week to find out the issues that Australians are most interested in ahead of the election campaign. One of the strong themes that came through yesterday after those scenes in the Oval Office was, what are we going to do? What's Australia's role now in supporting Ukraine? Do you think it should be increased at this point, or what should we do? And what about the question about peacekeepers as well?
I think Australia's military and humanitarian assistance for Ukraine has been very important, and it should continue, and we should continue to examine what else we can do in that department. I was concerned in Senate estimates this week to hear about the delays in supplying the M1 Abrams tanks to Ukraine, which we promised some time ago and which very little progress has been made. We need equipment like that, which is no longer necessary for Australia, to be on the front lines in Ukraine as soon as possible, to bolster them as much as possible. As far as I'm aware, David, there's been no request for Australian troops as part of a peacekeeping force, and I think it's premature to speculate about that. Let's see where we go. But I think we also have to recognise that our own neighbourhood is a pretty tough environment, and we've got our own security challenges here, which are our first priority.
When it comes to Donald Trump, we saw those scenes yesterday. We also saw during the week the US vote with Russia against a UN motion that was condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We know he wants to take ownership of Gaza and Greenland. We know he is going to erect these new trade barriers that could hurt Australia. Peter Dutton's called Donald Trump a big thinker and shrewd. How would you describe Donald Trump now?
David, again, when I was last on your program, we talked about the fact that sometimes Australia, as a sovereign liberal democracy, disagrees with our friends and partners, even our closest allies, including the United States. And if and when we do so, we'll be comfortable saying so. In relation to Gaza, we have said that's not consistent with our foreign policy of a two-state solution. And in relation to President Trump's comments about how and when the Ukraine war started, Peter Dutton has been explicitly clear about this, that he does not agree with Donald Trump. President Zelenskyy is a democratically, legitimately elected leader. Vladimir Putin is a dictator. It was Russia that started this war, not Ukraine, and it is an invasion. It's not a special military operation, and we will not pull our punches on articulating our view of this issue.
So, given disagreements with the Trump administration on these big issues, do you think Australia should be reconsidering at all things like AUKUS or our intelligence sharing with the Trump administration?
Not for a minute, David. In fact, I think we should double down on those and we should bring forward them as much as we can. I want to see AUKUS delivered in an even more timely way. I want to see other military commitments brought forward. We've announced today, David, that we're going to restore the 4th squadron of F-35 5th-generation fighter jets that the Albanese government cancelled, because we think we do need 100 of those, and we think that that's an incredibly successful part of our intimate military alliance with the United States.
Let's talk about that. I was going to come to this announcement today, $3 billion for the 28 additional Joint Strike Fighters. Why do we need 100 F-35s?
Well, as far back as the Defence White Paper in 2009, David, it was articulated that 5th-generation strike fighters were going to be absolutely critical to Australia's national security and our defence, and that we would need 100 of them. And it was the bipartisan policy of both parties for a decade that we should acquire 100 of the Joint Strike Fighters. Even the Gillard government proposed that we should secure these. But in one of its many cuts to our defence capability, this government cancelled the 4th Squadron, cancelled 28 Joint Strike Fighters that we otherwise would have received. And we think that's a mistake. And this is a down payment on our commitment for increased and faster defence spending, given the deteriorating security environment.
OK, but I mean, clearly the decision was taken. We had a defence strategic review that we really need to ramp up shipbuilding and submarines and all of that. So defence spending is increasing on those fronts. But back to the question, why do we need more F-35 Joint Strike Fighters? What's the reason for more spending there?
Because it's the most capable Joint Strike Fighter platform available today. It's the most capable 5th-generation fighter platform available today, and it sends a very strong message about Australia's preparedness to defend ourselves and to defend our interests and to work with our allies. David, we're in the business of preventing conflict.
Just so viewers are aware, these are used in defending Australia, really, aren't they?
Yes, but with air-to-air refuelling, they can also have a very significant range as well, and they can project Australia's force into the region, and we should do that because, as I was about to say, we're in the business of preventing conflict, and the best way to prevent conflict is to be credible with our deterrence. We can't do that alone. We have to do that in concert with our allies in the region, obviously including the United States, but also Japan and the Philippines and others, and this is a very important, tangible commitment in that task.
And $3 billion, where does that come from?
We'll be outlining all of our expenses in the campaign as normal, David, all of our costings at the normal time in the normal way. But as I said, this is a down payment on our commitment to increased and faster defence spending. It was revealed in Senate estimates this week, David, that Labor has already walked away from their commitment only a year ago to spend 2.4% of GDP by the end of the decade. Now it looks like it's going to be 2.33% instead of 2.4%, and this is not the time to be walking away from a commitment like that.
OK, but just on the cost here, you honestly can't say where this $3 billion will come from. Do you know, or is that something you haven't worked out yet?
David, as you know, the oppositions reveal their costings in the normal way during the election campaign, and we'll do that in a way that's transparent and can be interrogated at the time.
Is this from within the defence budget, or is this additional money for defence?
David, we've been very clear that we are going to increase defence spending because the strategic environment is deteriorating.
I mean,
we're not going to cut defence spending like this government has.
OK, but would you go beyond the 2.4%, or are you talking about the same envelope of money?
David, it's fair of you to ask, but I'm not going to announce our costings on your program today, nor am I going to announce our defence policy on your program today. This is the first commitment. You will have more to hear from us.
This may be just redirecting money within defence from one project to this.
David, one of your great talents of an interviewer is to ask a question multiple times in the hope you get a different answer, but I'm not going to give you a different answer to this question, no matter how many times you ask it.
No, fair enough, but I do think Australians deserve to know answers to questions like this when we're talking about...
And they will.
Yeah, OK.
And they will.
All right. Look, talking of China, it would seem that this announcement following the big story we've been following over the last week of this Chinese task group sailing around the continent might be time to show that Australia is willing to push back a little as well. Why do you think China has sent these 3 warships on this tour around Australia?
Well, the words of the Chief of the Defence Force, Admiral Johnson, this was an unprecedented move. In the words of the Secretary of the Department of Defence, they were engaged in rehearsal, and in the words of the Director General of National Intelligence, this was provocative. I think we would be very unwise not to heed the message of this. This is unprecedented, this is extraordinary, and the Prime Minister's attempt to mislead the public about this and to play down the seriousness of this is a grave mistake. We need to use all the tools available in our diplomatic arsenal to push back on this, to make very clear that the lack of notice in any form to the Australian military prior to the conducting of these military exercises in our region is not acceptable, even if it is consistent with international law. And we need to make sure that we have the capability to adequately surveil activities like this in our region so that we're not reliant on Virgin Australia pilots to be the first point of referral.
Was this gunboat diplomacy, as your colleague Andrew Hastie called it?
Yes, and Peter Harcher, the international editor of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, called it the same thing. I mean, that's literally what it is. They're sending warships to our region to make a diplomatic point.
To threaten Australia?
Pardon me?
To threaten Australia?
Well, the Secretary of the Department of Defence said this was a rehearsal. I don't know how else we can interpret activity in our region. Let's remember that the Tasman Sea, unlike the South China Sea, is a very remote part of the world. It is not a significant trading route. There are no disputed features or islands. There are no competing international legal claims for jurisdiction or territory. This is an extraordinary act, and I think we should take it seriously.
So, I mean, you'd be aware of this. The Liberal Party's post-election review said that you do need to rebuild relations with the Chinese community, and since then Peter Dutton has said he's pro-China, that he wants a stronger relationship with China than Anthony Albanese. Your colleagues are accusing them of gunboat diplomacy. How do you match those two? How do you get are you pro-China?
David, we should be measured and confident in our dealings with the Chinese government because we have significant equities in this relationship. The trading relationship is mutually beneficial, and we want that to continue and grow as much as possible because it is beneficial to Australian businesses and exporters and farmers and others, just as it is beneficial to Chinese consumers as well. So we want a strong relationship with China, but that doesn't mean we're going to allow them to walk all over us. It doesn't mean we're going to allow them to intimidate us. It doesn't mean we're going to allow them to coerce us, because our responsibility is to stand up for Australia. And in Peter Dutton, you'll have a strong Prime Minister who will always do so. He won't downplay it like Anthony Albanese has done and try and mislead the Australian people about what happened here. OK, well, just on the notifications that were given, apparently Papua New Guinea was given at least 2 weeks notice by China. What does that tell you? And should Papua New Guinea have passed on the heads up to Australia? It's absolutely remarkable that after a quote-unquote stabilised relationship between Australia and China, our comprehensive strategic partner, that they are giving weeks heads up to the PNG government of these exercises, but no notice at all to the Australian government, despite the Prime Minister's claims to the contrary. I think this is a troubling data point. It is evidence that the stabilisation process is far from complete, and that we need to demonstrate our own strength and our own resilience in this relationship in order to make it the mutually respectful relationship we want it to be.
There was, of course, before the last election, a Chinese surveillance vessel that came up and down the West Australian coast. We had Chinese warships that popped into Sydney Harbour back in 2019. The Morrison government was aware of it but didn't tell the public. Have these notifications been given in the past?
I don't know the circumstances of both of those instances, except that both of them were reported publicly in the media and were addressed and commented in the time. But as Admiral Johnson said, this is unprecedented. We've never had a live fire exercise from the Chinese military in the Tasman Sea ever before, and we should take it seriously. And
New Zealand was asked to take on some of the surveillance once the Chinese ships started moving across the Tasman Sea. Saw you raising some concern about this in estimates during the week. What's your view? Should we have handed over monitoring to New Zealand?
Well, David, the Defence Industry Minister, Pat Conroy, has said that the surveillance was unprecedented, the highest levels of surveillance we should ever have. Well, that is sort of obvious, you would hope, given that this is an unprecedented activity. But if that is the case, how come we weren't notified about this event except by Virgin Australia? And how come we still don't know, as the Defence Minister admitted over the weekend, whether or not a live firing exercise was actually carried out in the first exercise? I mean, these are major gaps in our knowledge, and it is difficult for me to understand how our surveillance could not be adequate to pick that up.
But do you think we should rely on New Zealand to help with this sort of monitoring?
Well, of course it's appropriate, David, to work with our closest defence partner, our ANZAC partner in New Zealand, and it's appropriate to share that load. But I don't understand why the coverage wasn't adequate to ensure that we were notified first, and that we didn't, and that we still don't know whether or not a live firing exercise took place, or indeed whether a submarine has accompanied this task group.
A couple of other things. You mentioned defence spending, and we know the opposition's made that commitment today of $3 billion. Would you cut foreign aid to pay for additional defence spending, as the British Labor Prime Minister's doing?
David, I don't want to disappoint you or your viewers on this question as well, but we'll be announcing any policies in relation to foreign aid and our costings in the usual way at the usual time.
But do you think, just on foreign aid, that this so-called soft diplomacy, whether it's an NRL deal with PNG or the security arrangements with Tuvalu and Kiribati, are they important?
Of course, our diplomacy is important. Of course, our foreign aid program is important. It's taxpayers' money and it's spent in Australia's national interest. And I think it has a particularly important role to play in our own region in the Pacific.
All right. And just a final one on the Home Affairs portfolio. You've talked about restructuring this, if you're the Minister, bringing ASIO and the Australian Federal Police back into Home Affairs from Attorneys General. Would you also stick with the current Secretary of Home Affairs, Stephanie Foster, or would you replace her?
David, it's not appropriate for me to canvass that publicly prior to the election. As you know, it's not the role of the Minister to choose the Secretary of a department. It's the role of the Prime Minister to do that. And we'll make those decisions if and when we win the election, not before.
Do you have confidence in the current Secretary of the department?
I'm concerned with the way the Department of Home Affairs has conducted itself on several issues, but in particular in recent weeks in relation to Tony Burke's industrial-scale election eve express citizenship ceremonies. It was disclosed in Senate estimates this week that the department arranged these ceremonies according to the minister's personal availability, even though it's not necessary for him to be there to officiate these ceremonies. And they occurred, there were 25 of them, 21 of them were held in Labor seats, and Tony Burke ensured that Labor MPs were invited to participate in them, but Liberal MPs weren't. So I think this has been a real problem. I think the department could have and should have pushed back more on that.
The Secretary should have stopped this happening.
Well, I think we don't know what conversations happened between the department and the Minister. That's not transparent to me.
Senator James Paterson, thanks for joining us this morning.
Thanks, David.
All right, we're going to come back to those Chinese warships and some of the fallout from that politically in Australia as well. But I want to continue this conversation on Ukraine just quickly. Back to our panel, Clare, Armstrong, Michael Stutchbury and Shalailah, Medhora. Look, what did you make of that, Clare? Again, strong support for Ukraine, but walking that line on not criticising Donald Trump. I think James Paterson, if anything, though, is more willing to say, well, we disagree on Gaza, we disagree on Ukraine.
Yeah, I think it's, I mean, just as an aside, you can kind of see why the Liberals have nominated him party spokesman for the election coming up.
They have, have they? Right.
Well, that's the rumour. But I think, yeah, the way that he's articulated that differentiation, I mean, you have a bit more leeway to do that when you aren't the government, right? We talk a lot. There was a clip earlier about whether Donald Trump knew what AUKUS was earlier in the week. He definitely doesn't know. No offence to James, who James Paterson is, and you do get a bit more, I think, latitude to make those comments. We even saw a week ago Peter Dutton was tweeting quite stringent support of Zelenskyy after Donald Trump made those early comments about calling him a dictator. So I think you do get a bit more freedom to comment when you are the opposition.
Let's talk about these Chinese vessels. There's a school of thought that, we shouldn't panic. This, we do exercises all the time in the South China Sea. These is international waters, they're allowed to do it. But on the other hand, as James Paterson points out, you've got Defence pointing out that this is unprecedented. This hasn't happened before, the live fire exercise and so on. Should we be worried about this?
Yeah, on the one hand, you could say, as the Chinese did, this is in accordance, and as in the government says, accordance with international law, so that's all sort of fine. But I think most of Australia, the Australian people, and the whole establishment really should be, and are concerned and a bit shocked that the Chinese have come down with a small flotilla conducting live fire episodes.
The main ship in it, though, is a biggie. Big ship. It's got twice as much power as our most
We didn't know about
powerful
it.
ship.
There was no advance of warnings. We're supposed to have stabilised our relationship with China. If Beijing really wanted to do that, you would have thought that the protocol would be to give some advance warning, so it wasn't the whole thing of Virgin commercial airliner, passenger airliner, picking it up. We did seem to be a bit of a shambles as to how we were surveilling it and then how we described it and what was going on. So that's not I think that's a real wake-up call. I think overall this goes to the breakdown of the rules-based order. The security order, which stops things like Putin taking big parts of Ukraine and what might happen with Taiwan, and the trading order, which stops trade wars breaking out and hitting countries like Australia. The Australian political debate and going into the election has tried to sort of ignore this, and it tries to get around. The parties try to have their debate about, Labor, we're going to spend more on health. Will the opposition match it? How are you going to pay for it? We're going to cut public servants. You're going to cut public servants. It's a very narrow debate, and I think what we're seeing now is that these external factors, the reality of Australia's circumstance in this disrupted world, it needs to start affecting an election debate, because we are going to have to spend a lot more on defence, We can't spend a lot on all these other things because the budget's in deficit for the next 10 years. So really the whole national debate really starts to focus, not get totally alarmed, but deal with the realities that confront us.
And just on whether what China is doing at the moment with this exercise has anything to do, timing-wise, with the uncertainties around Donald Trump and questions amongst allies about how reliable he is. I did talk for the podcast this week to Richard McGregor from the Lowy Institute for his thoughts on whether the two are linked at all, whether China's trying to take advantage of these uncertainties around Trump. Here's what he said.
I think it's a longer term thing than that. I think there's other ways of turning up the wick on that. And of course, China doesn't really need to underline the unreliability or unpredictability of Trump. Trump does that all himself.
He's doing that himself. Yeah, he's doing that himself. You can catch that full interview with the QR codes there. This, I think, Richard's right though. This is consistent with a long-term trend we've seen from China doing more and more exercises as it's grown its naval power, its blue water navy in particular, Shalailah, and now doing this lap around the Australian continent. It has caused anxieties though and political headaches for Albanese.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's like we heard, it's China sniffing the wind and going, oh, the US's attention is elsewhere. This is a perfect opportunity for us to launch in and say that the US isn't the sheriff in the Pacific anymore. It's like making that case that Australia is exposed when it comes down to it. But you're right, it's causing a lot of political headaches for the Prime Minister about who knew what when, this sort of like overturning of protocol of when China should be informing us of these kind of things. I think the usual is 24 to 48 hours. We didn't get that. We got that, I think, half an hour into the live exercise. The fact that our allies took so long for New Zealand to get the message back to Australia, the fact that PNG hasn't told us, all of this stuff really leads to this headache. And then you've got the Prime Minister who is trying really hard to hammer home the diplomacy angle, because no one can argue that our relationship diplomatically with China is better now than it was several years ago. Yeah. And he has to walk that fine line of saying, well, we're in a really good position, but then having all of this background
there are trade benefits, no doubt, from that better relationship. But just on that moment with the naval, the live firing exercise in the Tasman Sea and the notification that was or wasn't given, I just want to go through what happened here. So this was the initial claim from the Prime Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister about the notification that was given.
China issued, in accordance with practice, an alert that it would be conducting these activities, including the potential use of live fire.
It's not certain that live firing took place, but they definitely did notify an event yesterday, and they did so with very little notice.
They definitely did notify, but here's what we heard from Defence in the Senate estimates hearing.
You're now telling me that notification was not received, at least, by Defence, by Australia, until after it commenced. That's not any notification at all, is it?
No.
So, Claire, they sent out a radio signal, but no one picked it up until the Virgin pilot did.
So many things to say about this. So the alert that the Chinese sent out only had a range of about 20 nautical miles, I think. That is a short-range radio wavelength. You had to be a Virgin flight flying over, or there was also a New Zealand ship close by. Essentially what happened Friday a week ago was the kind of confusion that was born out of that notification coming via air services, briefing from Virgin to journalists, kind of created a situation where people thought that the live firing was going straight up into the air rather than
aiming at a target in the water.
Horizontally. So I think that part of the government's garbled response on Friday was trying to play down the fact that there were not missiles shooting directly into the air and we're having, an MH17 kind of situation.
Still, you don't want to be flying over a live firing exercise, I would guess.
Well, this is now one of many times where we have seen the Prime Minister struggle on communication. And while he is absolutely right to say that, he's the Prime Minister, he doesn't get into the weeds on everything, when you are talking about a live fire exercise in the Tasman Sea, it doesn't hurt to front up and say, we got the notification at 10:10, it began at 9:30, we've already raised through all the channels with China that we're unhappy with this.
And that's worth noting, it was even raised by the Foreign Minister.
It never came from the government, it only came from estimates. If we hadn't have happened to have had Senate estimates this past week, we may still be wondering what the timeline of events were. And I think that was the misjudgment of the Prime Minister.
Especially on an issue like national security, where their perceived weakness of Labor in the electorate is that they're soft on this stuff. Like, you want to be out there making as strong statements as you possibly can within the diplomatic framework, obviously, on these issues, and that seems to have been a failure here.
All right. Well,
it is a worry that the politics of this can be influenced by the battle for the Chinese vote in certain seats, such as Chisholm. Like, you don't want those sort of things influencing national security debate. What we saw in the past week is not up to scratch. This could be the most consequential circumnavigation of Terror Australia since Matthew Flinders in 1800, and look what happened after that.
Yeah, exactly. Look, it was Peter Dutton, though, on the back foot on another front this week, and we don't see that terribly often. We haven't for a while for the opposition leader, but this was over his various investments in properties and shares. It was Sam Maiden in the news.com that had that story first up about the shares that he bought, bank shares that he bought during the global financial crisis. Now, Sam, as I understand it, gave him 4 or 5 days to respond before she published the story. He didn't categorically deny having inside knowledge. He later did, though, later in the week, he gave a pretty firm denial.
Did you know that the stimulus package was coming?
No, Ben. And I mean, the fact is that I wasn't privy to, particularly from opposition, to insider information or anything other than what was publicly available.
So he hadn't bought shares for years, buys these bank shares right before this Rudd Bank announcement, the bank bailout during the global financial crisis. Look, there's no evidence that he did get inside knowledge. Is there a political problem here? Just as, you know, Anthony Albanese might have been politically unwise to buy a clifftop home during a housing crisis, was Peter Dutton politically unwise to go buy bank shares during a global financial crisis?
I think undeniably, yes, that's probably been the most poignant argument or blow that Labor have managed to land, is that this is an election that's pretty light on policy to date, pretty heavy on character, and they're rushing to, not dissimilar to elections past, to find the opposition leader before the opposition leader has an opportunity to find himself, and they are looking to paint him as someone who was opportunistic, focused inwardly at a time when, you know, some MPs have said, you know, the rest of the machinery of government and opposition were focused on the country. It's obviously their prerogative to make that argument, and Peter Dutton's to disagree with it, just as it was Anthony Albanese's a few months ago on the House. But you know, this series of events, the sequencing is there for all to interpret, and
does it look suspicious, do you think, the purchase of these bank shares?
Look, I think the Dutton story is an aspirational story. It's not like the contrast with the Anthony Albanese, the welfare mum. You know, they've lifted themselves up by their bootstraps. You know, I think it's a totally valid thing to have a vigorous scrutiny of the person and his background and his financial dealings.
You expect that at that level?
That's certainly, and so it's totally valid to do that. Whether they've found anything, that there's no smoking gun and all this, I think it was a good thing for people to buy bank shares. You know, we wanted people to support the banks, to go in there.
He was doing something for the national good, was he?
And you know, this is
thinking of the nation.
And there's nothing wrong, in a sense, with buying some bank shares. I think the idea that, oh, you know, by doing this is somehow heartless, thinking about all the people that are struggling, you shouldn't go and, you know, buy some bank shares. And I think there's a conflation of particularly with the stream of things, the January 23 one, and people are calling it a bank bailout and all these things. Quite a few things happened in that period. And the one thing was the day after, on the 24th, Rudd announced it wasn't a bank bailout. It was a thing between the federal government. They put in $2 billion. The banks, they put in $2 billion into a thing which was to support commercial property, because the foreign banks, the big foreign banks, were pulling out of Australia, basically. So it's a bit of a Team Australia effort by it. Now, the shares did go up, and bank shares did sort of bottom at that stage. But unless you get a real thing which says, oh, we had particular knowledge of some programs going to be announced the next day, because a lot of this information was flying around the place and so forth. So I don't think it's inherently a bad thing. I think Labor put out Andrew Charlton there. That didn't go down really well, because he's a very bright...
I've got this here. So this was Andrew Charlton is a Labor MP, but back in the day he was in Kevin Rudd's office at the time of all of this, and he went on 7:30 the other night to say his jaw dropped to the floor when he heard that Peter Dutton had been, you know, out and about buying bank shares at this time when this global financial meltdown was going on. I think a few jaws hit the floor, though, when he revealed how and when he heard about all of this.
I learnt it when I saw the information that had come out. That had come out in relation to his register of interests.
You mean this week?
No, before this week, I was made aware of it.
By whom?
By the Prime Minister's office, who had been looking at it.
Now, look, this brings us to this whole dirt unit, or how the sausage is made on politicians giving material or suggestions to journalists. Claire, I don't know. This is insider, so I suppose we can talk about how the sausage is made a little bit here. But what's happened here? Is this a dirt unit within Labor that's pushing this around?
I think dirt unit is probably a bit generous, but obviously tailors all of time that major political parties have staff that are trawling over this kind of history. We'll see more and more of it as we get into the election, and there are candidates who maybe haven't quite been vetted to the extent that they should have been. I think both sides give as good as they get here, and they complain equally when the mud comes their way. But the reality of the journalism political ecosystem is journalists don't have all eyes everywhere all at once. They're not necessarily thinking,
Get information.
I was in high school in 2009. I wasn't really thinking, gee, I should really look at who was buying shares during the GFC.
No.
Sometimes that's just how these things come to light. The public should celebrate that it comes to light.
Yeah.
Jackie Lambie has called for this to be referred to the National Integrity Commission or the National Anti-Corruption Commission. So we may find out a little bit more about it. We may not.
All right.
Can I say, they put out Andrew Charlton there. He was there at the time in the thick of it. That's why he's there. But he's a very bright economist. Labor should be making much more of him in actual policy formulation.
Right.
I wouldn't put him out again to be the tactical.
To be the head kicker. Look, just another one finally here, Stutch. We saw Jim Chalmers during the week make a quick trip to Washington. He met his counterpart, the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent. Obviously made the pitch for Australia to get an exemption from the tariffs. No guarantees given. We still don't know where that's going to land. But generally, how do you think that whole event during the week with the super funds over there as well, really trying to show off, we got lots of dough, we're willing to invest, please be nice to us. How do they go?
There's a few angles. It's quite an impressive thing to have all the big super funds there, to get Scott Bessent, the new Treasury Secretary, and other key figures around at sort of breakfast, and then an Australian embassy event, and then on to New York with the big private investment banks and so forth. It was there to basically put the Australia's case that not only do we run a trade deficit with the US, but we've got all this money. The super funds have got $400 billion invested in the US, and we could invest $1 billion in there. So you should look favourably upon us. And it was really from the super funds to say Australia has now got, the impressive thing is, one of the largest pools of pension fund money, they call it, in the world, destined to become the second biggest. Now that brings a lot of issues with it. So they did manage to impress upon there. And the really interesting thing to say, the industry super funds with a lot of union influence are saying we're going to put a lot of money into the Trump economic program.
Exactly.
Now, even with the bad stuff, the tariffs, then what you might say from many people's point of view, the good stuff, the deregulation, the lower taxes, we're putting our money, and the tech leadership, we're putting our money into that. You might say, well, why don't we do a bit of that sort of Trump stuff back here if it's so good for the economy?
Interesting point. All right. Our panel, Shalailah, Medhora, Michael Stutchbury and Clare Armstrong, will be back very shortly with some final observations. Time now for Mike Bowers and Talking Pictures.
I'm photographer Mike Bowers. I've come to the National Library in Canberra where the Fit to Print exhibition, an exhibition that charts the birth of photojournalism in this country. And I'm talking pictures this morning with Fairfax photographer Alex Ellinghausen. Very warm welcome.
Good morning, Mike. Thank you for having me.
Peter Dutton faced questions about his investment this week.
Yeah, look, Labor spent this week asking questions about what he knew.
But according to him, he was just on the money. I did love this David Rowe cartoon. The thought of Murray Watt in a jacuzzi, however, I find very, very disturbing, Alex.
Oh, look, warning or no warning, a live firing drill. It's just not cool anytime in a jacuzzi.
Pete, it's Muzza.
What?
Yeah, Murray Watt.
What?
We're conducting live fire drills from your jacuzzi.
There's so much detail in the nuclear curtains.
The little Gina on the side table here. Beautiful Matt Golding cartoon. It's a bit of a cliffhanger here with both of the leaders and their property portfolio for Dutton and the Copacabana view from the hill.
Well, property definitely is an obsession with this country.
So why shouldn't the leaders of our parties be involved? Matt Johnson, I think, hit the nail on the head, didn't he? Wait a moment, this is my own medicine as the insider trading pills come back to haunt him.
Yeah, it's always a can of worms, but Dutton denied any wrongdoing.
Beautiful Cathy Wilcox. Peter Dutton on top of climate denial, ministerial discretion, undermining institutions, stoking division, racist dog wiggles, nuclear policy, no details and free lunch. Albo's out of touch and I should know.
You can just see Jody.
Jody and Albo having a little drink on the cliff top.
How's the serenity in this one?
Medicare was big on the agendas of both parties, and I love this Mark Knight because really you wouldn't trust the bedside manner of either of these two doctors. Next, take your pick. Alex, it's one thing to be young and green, but Australia's most famous cephalogist, Anthony Green, he's calling time on his career. Matt Golding has Anthony Green here. I'm calling it for Anthony Green.
It just feels like it won't be the same without him. I mean, you associate election campaigns with the sausage sizzle and Anthony Green.
It'll be Casey Briggs and sausage sizzles. David Pope has done a beautiful caricature of him in that classic pose. Happy retirement. We're all chipping in for one last election present as a result. Too complex to quickly call.
Well, it might be the hardest one for him to call.
Yeah. Chinese warships conducted live fire drills off our coast. The focus definitely turned on water matters. Mark Knight's done this lovely cartoon. What is the Chinese Navy doing off the east coast of Australia?
Don't tell me we came all this way to spy on handsome boy fluffing up his beach house for retirement.
From my front yard, I can see Chinese live fire drills. Election latest, Albo's polls dive.
At the Copa.
At the Copa. Warren Brown has got the Chinese warships coming all the way into Lake Burley Griffin.
You can't miss that one.
Yeah. These Chinese warships seem to be getting awfully close, PM.
Let's not overreact.
Yeah. Senate estimates is always a really busy week for you guys because you have to keep an eye on all the different committees. There was a little moment this week when Sarah Hanson-Young actually spoke the truth. She said the quiet bit out loud.
There was a bit of a spotlight on the Creative Australia hearing this week because of what happened to Khaled Sabsabi and Michael D'Agostino over the dumping at the Venice Biennale. Yeah. So there was one of these late night sittings and Sarah Hanson-Young did say that. She said not many people actually watch Senate question time.
You got this wonderful photo. I think she speaks truth.
Oh, I don't think a lot of them actually want to admit that not many people watch Senate question time.
Mick Seekers took this photo of Murray Watt. He loves a reflection to make him look two-faced, doesn't he? Go Mick. He also loves a Michaelia Cash shot. I did love his Sarah Hanson-Young, especially the twinkle in the eye here. Alex, you're the current incumbent of Fairfax Photography. We're sitting in amongst a lot of the work of our forebears.
And you've done a wonderful job curating this beautiful exhibition. It's amazing what these glass plates can produce.
I really marvel at how they actually did it. Look, it's been a great pleasure unpicking events this week. I'll let you do the honours.
Thank you, Mike. Back to you, David.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Mike. And it's a terrific exhibition. Some final observations. I've just got one quickly. There's an opening at the Commonwealth Grants Commission, which decides on the carve-up of GST revenue for the states and territories. And Saul Estlake, the esteemed economist, who's long been a fierce critic of this WA GST deal that Scott Morrison put in place, Labor's continued, he calls it the worst public policy this century so far. He's put his hand up. He's told me he's ready, willing and able. He'll do it for free. Somehow I doubt Labor will take him up.
He wants more money for Tasmania.
He probably does. Shalailah.
It's Mardi Gras weekend, so we recently had federal hate crime legislations that take into account crimes against the LGBTQIA+ community. But we also know that this time of year is when homophobic, transphobic attacks really do increase on that community, and we are seeing open slather across the world on attacks on minority rights. So it's just a reminder that we have to keep vigilant to make sure that the rights of everyone are protected in Australia.
Yeah, fair enough. Stutch.
Jim Chalmers, the Treasurer, was out and about this morning on his birthday, so he's working hard. And he was quizzed on the story by John Keogh and Ronald Misen in the Australian Financial Review magazine out on Friday, where it quoted meetings between Chalmers and the former governor, Phil Lowe, with a bit of tension involved, but also between Chalmers and Michelle Bullock, the governor. After in June, the board minutes pointed out that government spending after the state and federal budgets were driving up demand, and it got all the headlines about that might increase inflation and keep interest rates up. Tension was reported there. Chalmers has come out and said, oh, it's not all completely right, without denying it. But the public policy point here is the Reserve Bank government and the Reserve Bank need to be able to call out seriously if government spending is keeping interest rates and inflation up. And so it's a real failure of policy if that's not allowed.
Yeah, all right. Claire.
I've always said it's a fool's errand to talk about when you think the election is going to be, though I'll admit I did drag my suitcase out of the garage yesterday thinking I might need to get packed this week. It's not today, but maybe for next week. However, I can say for sure that their government hasn't ruled out whether it's going to do a budget, a PFO or a budget outlook. They are leaving all options on the table.
They still might do it. We might be off for a May election, or it could be April 12. Who knows? We'll have more on that, no doubt, next week. Thank you all very much for joining us this morning. Finally, if you were watching Senate estimates the other day, you might have seen this wonderful Australian version of Yes Minister. We'll leave you with that. Thanks for watching.
Secretary, when the Minister was asked about the costs of the arrangement with Nauru, he said, this was on the ABC 7:30 report, he said, and I quote, "The costs of arrangements like this don't get disclosed, and that's been the case for decades." That's not true, is it, what he said? It's just plainly not true. It's not true, is it? Secretary, it's not true.
Senator, I think the Minister has said what the Minister has said.
You're making us all feel very excited about being here.